Greetings everyone! Let's talk about the E3 press conferences and how good my predictions from the other video were. Where do we start this time? I would say let's start at the Microsoft press conference and their big announcement. As the first big console developer these days, Microsoft announced their new version of the Xbox One. It is called Project Scorpio. So there will be 3 versions of the Xbox One available and supported in the future. First, the Xbox One itself, the Xbox One S, which is the Slim Edition that was also announced at E3, and Project Scorpio, which will be the 4K gaming Xbox One, and it will be released holiday 2017. My prediction was that they are building the PlayStation 4 Neo and the Xbox One Project Scorpio mainly to improve the VR experience. And Phil Spencer exactly mentioned this in his presentation, but he also mentions that they are going for 4K gaming, and this is a huge surprise for me. But let me explain some thoughts behind my prediction. First of all, 4K is incredibly demanding in terms of processing power. You are doubling the resolution from Full HD. That means 4 times the amount of pixels have to be rendered. If you double the resolution, you have 4 times the pixels. It's not double the amount, it's 4 times the amount. Right now, it's a huge problem to render games at the highest possible settings and 4K resolution at an acceptable frame rate on computers with only one graphics card. Just have a look at some benchmarks. For example, GTA 5. On a $1,600 computer with just one graphics card in it, you reach about 33 frames per second. But keep in mind that this is on the absolute highest possible settings. You find many other benchmarks that have higher frame rates on average, but they always have some settings lowered. And the only graphics card that can pull that off right now is Nvidia's GTX 1080. But the data for the GPU of Project Scorpio isn't matching the data for the GTX 1080. Project Scorpio's GPU has 6 teraflops and is an AMD GPU. The 1080 has almost 9 teraflops, even though teraflops are only one of many indicators and are considered alone not that important, but they still imply a vague direction, especially since we know that Nvidia cards seem more efficient in that regard. Also, I can't imagine that they will build a console with a GPU that high-end. Also keep in mind that PCs not only need a very expensive GPU, but also a somewhat expensive CPU. On consoles these days they combine a GPU and a CPU, and that is called an APU. And creating an APU this powerful is actually an impressive feat. But this leads me to the question, how much will this console cost? Obviously we don't know it yet, and in 1.5 years hardware will be a lot cheaper. But still, this console won't ship for $400. But let's move back to the benchmarks. As mentioned, it is hard to achieve a constant frame rate of 30 or even 60 FPS at 4K resolution, but the struggling has a lot to do with the highest possible settings. If you just lower the settings to high, 30 FPS and even 60 become more likely. On the other hand, if they still push graphical fidelity over performance as we see it today, it's possible that these upgraded consoles will have similar problems to achieve constant 30 FPS for future titles as consoles today with current titles. But of course it is still possible, and Microsoft made it very clear that that's what they are going for. Another point is that I was not expecting them to build a completely new console. Project Scorpio is not just a little update. Hardware wise, it's a completely new console. It's like the Xbox 2. And this leads me to my next point. Developing for a console has one big advantage. You only have to focus when optimizing on one or a few pieces of hardware. But now you increase that number. You have the Xbox One, you have the Xbox One S with also slightly different hardware, you have Project Scorpio, you have the PlayStation 4, you have maybe the PlayStation 4 Slim, and of course the PlayStation 4 Neo, and Nintendo NX is also coming. That is quite a lot of hardware now. Now you could say, what about PC games? There you have to optimize for several thousand different types of hardware. But that is not the case, they don't optimize for them all. What happens on PC is a game gets released, even AAA titles, they run absolutely horrible, and then AMD and Nvidia release driver updates, they optimize for their cards, and then the game runs suddenly a lot better. You have sometimes performance increases of, I don't know, 30 to 40%. You can't tell me that that is optimizing for 10,000 types of hardware. The reality is that game developers rely on the graphic card manufacturers to fix their games. And the reason why they are fixing the games is they want to sell their expensive cards. And the only reason you need an expensive card are those games. But inside the console cosmos, that is not possible. So they have to optimize their games themselves, and having more hardware means increased development costs. So this situation is actually not very good for console developers. And this is why some publishers have already complained about it. It's hard to foresee what exactly will happen, but maybe it will have a hit on AAA release cycles. To conclude, this is a very interesting move by Microsoft, and I can imagine that even Sony is surprised by this. And for me, this is probably one of the most interesting things of this E3. But let's move on. First of all, I'm not that deep into Xbox gaming because I don't own an Xbox, so I probably can't say too much about it, but for me it's always interesting what Microsoft is doing here. For example, I really like the new social features for Xbox One. They announced that you can now create your own tournaments and also create groups and some additional features. I think Microsoft is really making steps into the right direction for online console gaming here. They also announced Halo Wars 2, which was leaked before, and it will also come to PC for keyboard and mouse. It is an RTS game for consoles, and it is probably one of the best at it, and it will be very interesting to see how it works on PC compared to console. I'm really looking forward to this and think it's a very interesting title. Then there's a game I have totally forgotten that it even exists and I'm very interested in again. It is called Sea of Thieves and it is developed by Rare. It is pretty much Guns of Icarus Online, just in a sea pirate setting. If you don't know what Guns of Icarus Online is, it is a co-op PvP game where you have to control a ship with your friends. You can't control it alone, so you have to work together. Everyone has to fulfill a role to accomplish pretty much anything in the game, and that's a lot of fun. Sea of Thieves is pretty similar to it, maybe it has some more spins to it and you can go on islands and do stuff with your friends there, but it looked very interesting, even though I didn't like the presentation, to be honest. But let's move on. In my last video I made some predictions and a new Halo was not announced, so I was wrong there, but there's still some rumors around it. Then in my last video I talked a lot about Final Fantasy 15 and that it is maybe not the killer app that it needs to be. I have high concerns about the combat in this game, and actually they showed some of it in the Microsoft press conference. They showed us a boss fight and visually it looked absolutely amazing, but the fighting, the combat mechanics didn't look so great, to be honest. I admit that it is possible that they had technical issues with the controls because the fight wasn't really going well for them and they got hit a lot, but still, if the fight would have went well for them, it didn't look very interesting or compelling. Maybe the fighting system is just okay, but like I said in my other video, is an okay fighting system enough for this game? I'm still concerned and feel confident in my prediction, and that is not a good sign. The last few things I want to mention are first of all Recore, which they announced long ago, but now they showed us actual gameplay footage and it looked interesting. Also I like the art style of it a lot. Then they showed us Tekken 7 which is obviously a fighting game, but they only showed us a render trailer fight between Heihachi and Akuma. I don't want to interpret too much into it, but maybe they showed us some mechanics there. But the most interesting news is it will be also available on PC. That's very interesting, to be honest. The last thing I want to mention is Scalebound by Platinum Games. They also showed a giant boss fight, and from my perspective it looked better than the Final Fantasy XV boss fight, but I still think it only looked okay. It's interesting and it's Platinum Games, so maybe it's good. I like the mechanic that you can switch between ground fight and fighting on the back of your dragon in the air, but I have to say Nier Automata looked more interesting to me, and that is also made by Platinum Games. And this is pretty much everything I have to say about the Microsoft E3 press conference 2016. I know I haven't talked about every game like Forza or Gears of War 4, but I don't play those games, so I can't really comment on them. So the only thing left to say is that I will cover the other press conferences, or some of the other press conferences, in another video, maybe in a more compressed form. If you're interested, consider subscribing or following me on Twitter, or both. I hope you enjoyed this video, thank you for watching and goodbye.